Maybe I should sit back one so it looks like he's talking to a bunch of empty chairs.
We're sitting back here so I can take pictures.
Oh, that's a good idea. Oh man, I didn't realize I had coffee stains on the back of my keyboard. It's embarrassing.
You want some more?
No. Appreciate the offer though.
Sure, all right. Garrett, do we do this so that Twitch can comment in, or?
Yes, I have Twitch up and people can comment.
Okay. All right, I'll try to watch those.
Oh, I'll let you know if anything pops up.
Do it. All right.
Okay. Do you want me to OBS the thing? Did you already start?
It's already started,
Okay.
already recording.
Okay.
So you are good to start whenever you want.
Good to start? All right.
Ready?
Can everybody hear me? Is everyone making their way down here? All right. Now, for this one, it is going to be one of the longer presentations that has been done here. I've been here for most of them to see that they run from 20 minutes to like longer, 45 minutes. This one's going to be
3 hours.
yeah, not 3 hours, no.
2.
I clocked this one in at under an hour, but we'll see how it goes. I encourage everyone to get as close as possible and move your chairs up here because there's going to be audience participation. Yeah. Yeah. And I was also informed that for the people that are watching that are not here today, that are on Twitch, that they'll be able to ask questions and Garrett will help me answer them. So get ready to get started.
Uh-oh.
There is a spoiler alert for this one. Most of these games are a couple of years old, but if you haven't played any of them, then we're going to be discussing them. So.
You just give us a signal.
Sure, yeah.
Alright.
So we got a couple of late joiners here. We'll start in just a second. Alright, so the title of this talk is Joseph Campbell, the Mythic Structure in Video Games, and that's what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about the stories that are in the games that we all love and the games that you are all writing. So there's a few terms. If you are a writer, you've probably heard these terms before. Otherwise, it's just worth going over again. When we refer to the protagonist, we're talking about the main character, the most important character in a story. When we're talking about the antagonist, this is the character that is antagonizing the main character. So underneath and related to those topics of the protagonist, the deuteragonist is the second most important character. The threshold guardian is often aligned with the antagonist. They're the bad guys that you fight in the middle of the story. There's the fourth wall is a term that comes from the theater in Shakespeare's day. Someone would come towards the rest of the audience to talk directly to the audience. And QTE is a thing that we all have to try and use sparingly because we all hate them in video games. They are the quick time events. Joseph Campbell, the American contemporary mythologist, he would study different cultures and their myths, how they related to each other, and he wrote a book called The Hero of a Thousand Faces, which basically says that all the stories that we write might have different elements to them, but in essence we basically tell the same story over and over. So the story that games tell us, including our character, the game is inevitably going to feature at least one character, one that the player is in control over, the protagonist. These characters are, can anyone name for me a main protagonist of any one of their favorite video games?
Kirby.
Kirby, thank you.
Link.
Link, he's in this talk too. So there's some Nintendo fans in the audience. Okay. So in order for there to be like gameplay, you have to give the characters some sort of context, right? Otherwise, you just have a couple of characters that walk around on a screen and don't do anything. That context, when we're talking about stories, we're talking about some sort of struggle that they're going through. So those conflicts can be like in Modern Warfare or Halo or whatever, where there's these bad guys coming and you have to go to battle with them, or it can be something as simple as just trying to not die and have to face the consequences of the game over. And then hopefully, if you're writing a character-driven game, something that involves the characters, they have to go through some sort of change. Otherwise, if they're just static, they're just boring and not interesting. They have to either gain some power-ups in the game to defeat the final bad guy, or if it's more realism-based, if it's more character-driven, they have to go through the character's arc of going from being a weak character to a strong character. But Winston, you say, my game has no characters. Then all the rules are the same. There is still a story there. But the story is a little bit different, and I'm going to be talking about this. It's called the experience. And so there isn't a character on the screen, but then you, the game developer, the creator, you're creating a story that the player goes through. They're interacting with and struggling to play a game that is difficult and challenging them. So they are the main character. Let's see. I believe the title of the book was Save the Cat. It's a screenwriter's guide. Basically, if you make a character likable, if you have them do something like saving a cat from, the road or whatever, then that will bring the audience in and have the audience be on the side of your main character. So every character wants something, and then you have to provide the wants and needs of the characters and see that the audience will have some sympathy for them. Otherwise, it's just like nobody's interested. Nobody cares about this character if he either doesn't want anything out of life, he's just kind of just like wandering around and having things happen to him. That's not interesting. So like let's take an example here. Let's say for Mario, from the Mario games. What does he want at the beginning of the game? Right, he wants Princess Toadstool, he wants Princess Peach, and she keeps getting kidnapped. So a plot reaction is something to avoid. It's a caveat of having things happen to your main character. If your character doesn't have any drive or motivations of their own, if your character is just like reacting to other people's plans and just becoming a part of them, just getting swept along with the action with the rest of the movie or game or comic book or story, if they don't have any drive to make something happen, then that's called a plot reaction. It's just like the bank got robbed, and then everyone's just like, oh, I'm down on the floor, I'm not going to do anything. Well, if the bank gets robbed and then the hero decides to react by taking one of their guns away, that's not a plot reaction anymore. That's the character moving the plot forward. Right. So the exploration of myth. This goes back to Joseph Campbell. His formula for what he discovered was in all these stories that we tell is called the hero's journey. He breaks it up into 8 different parts, or 12 different parts it says here. I've seen other people try and take this formula and break it into 17 separate parts. So they've got like 5 different steps, but those extra 5 aren't necessarily in a lot of stories even. So, and even these 12 that you see in front of you right now aren't in every story. But what he says is that because these 12 elements are so common, that they kind of formulate the whole journey in and of itself. And it can even be broken down into like 4 quarters of like when the character is in what's known as the ordinary world at the very beginning. That's about the first quarter. because in the ordinary world you get the call to the adventure, which is you meet somebody that, like in Treasure Island, where was it Captain Flint who stays at the inn, and then he leaves a treasure map with someone as his last dying words, and he says, "Beware of the man with one leg." So that's a call to an adventure because they're being called out. There's a buried treasure out there. I want you to find it. And then the refusal of the call is just like, I don't know. I've got my life here. I've got my mom. I've got my inn. Do I really want to go search for this buried treasure? I could just stay comfortably put here. Well, we all know that doesn't really make a story. It's just like, how long would that story have been? The story of Treasure Island is just like, yeah, this pirate died and gave me a treasure map, and I just decided to stay home. Story's over. Not very interesting.
Alternate ending.
Alternate endings, yeah. Okay. So, what Campbell says about the myths, he studied ancient Greek mythology, and he said that in a lot of Western civilization, a lot of the stories that we tell, our heroes are heroes that are like Perseus in the ancient Greek myths. Basically, Perseus starts out just like any other person that he would have known. You know, maybe he was a fisherman. He knows how to use a net and a spear and catch some fish, provide his family. But then he goes to war. He learns all these things. You know, the gods come down and give him, like, Athena was the goddess of wisdom and warfare who guides him through his journey. She gives him an owl and, like, the magic, the mirror shield that he needs to defeat the Medusa and all these other things. So very quickly you get the iconic traditional hero that we all know who gets, like, better toys than anyone else gets to play with. So these Perseus-type heroes are Link and Batman and Adam Dennings, who gets to play with all these different, like, toys. And so because he's better equipped than anyone else, he's the one who's able to go up against the big bads in the end. I mean, like, it would be very interesting in your story to include another, like, side character. In Legend of Zelda, the Oracle of Ages, there's a side character, Ralph, who's kind of on the same quest as Link. He's kind of trying to save the same person and do the whole hero thing. But Ralph doesn't have the same level of equipment as Link does, and he can never overcome the challenges that Link can. So, you know, they have, like, a rivalry between the two of them. So, yeah. He's just like, it's at that point where Ralph becomes more of a comic relief character. So the call to adventure in these two games from the Nintendo GameCube era, we have Super Mario Sunshine and Luigi's Mansion. The call to adventure for Mario is whenever this is even before the game starts, for both of these actually, but you can tell it's implied that it happened because they show up at this other world to explore at the beginning of these games. So for Mario, it's the call that they got this vacation on the Delfino Island. For Luigi, he won a free mansion, and he doesn't understand the circumstances. He didn't even enter a contest of any kind, so... So you can see these kind of things from the hero's journey in these games. The meeting with the mentor, this character helps you, guides you along your way. Sometimes they give you things, even if it's just advice. Sometimes they're there with you for a long part of the journey. They're your like a tutorial character that helps you learn how the game world works. You know, the old man who says, just there in the cave, take this, it's dangerous to go alone. You know, the more sophisticated the games get, the more the characters can jump in and out of, like, actually being there with you in your game, or maybe it's just like a one-time thing. They just show up, they just tell you to go somewhere, and then you do it. The Threshold Guardians are... Every game is kind of intuitively doing this anyway. It's the bosses that you face. It's not the big bad boss at the end, but they're there, and they also help establish the world. Maybe they've got their own backstories, and how they relate to your plot is important, but a lot of this stuff is intuitive because we've been telling stories for so long that these characters tend to find themselves in our stories. Okay, so now is time to talk about that whole player experience thing. There's two different parts of the gameplay story that we create. One is the authored content. This is everything that we put down on paper, in code, in the game. You know, the final product that we release is all authored content. It's 100% us. So a couple of things to avoid is to, you know, make sure that you don't break your immersive gameplay. Things that I don't like to see in games whenever I am playing a game are those things that break my immersion. So for me, it's those levels that don't actually test you on the skills that you've developed in playing the game. It's just like you've been playing Mario, you've learned about the walls and platforms, you've learned not to fall down holes, you've learned not to get bit by turtles, and then suddenly, if in Mario it just broke down into like a rhythm-based dance game, like halfway through the game, it would be a completely different game, it would be a completely different type of level that is just like, why is this level in this game? So for me, in these more realistic kind of games, the more action-based games, it's in Dead Space, the turret section that you're suddenly stuck in until you can shoot enough meteors and protect the ship for long enough that you succeed and you get to move on back to slashing up the aliens. Or the forklift level in the Tomb Raider game, because it's just like, why am I driving a forklift around a King Arthur museum now? It also has to do with the tone of your game, because in a Mario game, everything's bright and cartoonish, but you look at some of the traps that are in like Bowser's Castle, and they're still relatively deadly looking. It's just that they have their own like feel to them. It's not like those spike traps are coated in the fresh blood of their victims, because this is an E-rated game. Alright, now the player experience, we've talked about the authored content, the game as it is when you release it. Player experience is everything else. You know, speedrunners, you know, like jokes, game-breaking glitches that are exploited, and, you know, just all the Let's Plays, all the people that can enjoy the material that you've created and find their own stories within it. What this difficulty has to do with is our own, like with the hero's journey, it's good to have like this period of rest where the characters like aren't just like constantly bombarded by stuff. I don't like it in games when the characters talk too much. They just like are constantly nonstop, like giving you information, and especially if you're in the middle of a boss fight, that's not the time when you're supposed to be giving the player new information. You're not supposed to be talking over the sound of explosions and blood and mayhem, because the player can't possibly be paying attention to that. So that's why they use this, what's called the bag system, is that after, like imagine in Dark Souls, whenever you're in the asylum prison, you get to look at the boss the first time, and maybe you can beat it the first time. There's a lot of players that have beaten the asylum demon the very first encounter when you have the broken sword, and that's it, and they've dodged enough and hit it enough times that it dies. But like most players, you'll read the note that tells you to run away the first time that you see it, and so you'll go through the doorway, and you'll have that period of rest where it's just like, okay, I've seen the boss, I know I'm going to have to fight that boss at some point in time, but now it's calmer, and I get to keep on exploring and finding out more about how I'm going to beat this boss. So I think it's a good idea to get your players to take a look at the boss before they have to actually defeat it. It can't always be done, but I still think that's good implementation of just giving them a little bit of information, just enough, just what they need. Alright, so when we manipulate what a player experience is comprised of, So it's when we think of what it is that we're actually doing, what we're making. What are we making here? We're making games, right? So for that to work, you have to always be aware of the player. You know, this is not just a movie that allows your players to walk in and press some buttons to make more things happen. You know, that's not gameplay. What we're talking about when we're talking about manipulating the player experience elements of what we're doing is to actually break the fourth wall and bring them in. Or to change a few things about our game, especially when it relates to the plot and you're trying to make the tone just a little bit darker or lighter or whatever you're trying to do with your plot. You know, this is how you can do it. There's some good and bad things that I want to talk about, especially when it comes to like all those things that I listed there, the scripted events, your cutscenes, your QTEs. So just show of hands, who here has played Skyrim? Right? Okay. So how much did the beginning of Skyrim suck?
Quite a bit, much.
Uh-huh. You spent a good 10 minutes riding in the back of a wagon, having this exposition dump as these characters explain to you the world. And, you know, again, it goes back to plot reaction. You're just reacting when things start happening to you because you're stuck, you're bound in one place on the wagon, and then a dragon comes, and then you can actually finally start playing the game. So this is one good thing that you don't want to do for player experience because you're kind of ruining it. For The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, I think the tone really changed as far as making sure that people knew that this was going to be a dark Zelda game when the character Midna, which is the deuteragonist of that game, the second most important character, she gets poisoned. And this is the first time that I've seen anyone get poisoned in a Zelda game. So, you know, she's ill, and it changes the game because you are no longer allowed to just explore wherever you want to do in this open world. Instead, you can only go through this one very narrow path directly to, you know, the source where she'll be healed later. More talking. Okay, there's more Twilight Princess later. I put it later. Again, in the recent iteration of the new Tomb Raider series by Square Enix, there's a lot of QTEs in that game. I don't hate them as much as when they pop up in other games, because there's a lot, but there's not, like, it's not totally saturated. It's not all bombarded with QTEs. So there's a lot towards the beginning whenever the plot reactions are kind of happening, whenever Laura's kind of a weaker character. But after that, there are hardly any towards the end of the game. So. And of course, this is like a good example of how to use player experience. And Hideo Kojima is intensely aware that what he's making is a video game. There will be someone to interact with, someone playing his game. So he's going to play them. He's going to force the player to play a different game, or, you know, find a way to beat him at, like, this is a video game. Come on, you know, stick the controller in the second controller slot. Just blew people's minds. Yeah, and then of course, Batman Arkham Asylum, it's again another good example of whenever you're aware that this is a video game that you're making. The video game developers made it so that Scarecrow's fear toxin causes you to think, as a player, that your system's crashing. And then it goes into Batman's nightmares about being sent to Arkham Asylum himself, and all that great stuff. Oops. So with those two tools, you kind of blend them together. You use one or the other. Hopefully you'll have the narrative impact to, like, if you're having the tone of your game be like, this is the hardest boss, like, you know, that you've faced thus far, this is a huge challenge. Well, you got to make that boss live up to that expectation that the player has, because if he's a breeze, then what the player's feeling is like, different than what you've been promising them, so they feel the letdown then. So what you are probably considering at this point as an indie game developer, if you're not a writer yourself, you're thinking about collaborating with a writer. This isn't just for these games that have the branching storylines and narratives or the huge like RPG elements. This isn't just for games that are like movies. This is for every game, you know. Unless the writing is so spare, so minimal, you know, it's like non-language based, you know, you're just using like glyphs and icons for everything, then you probably don't need a writer, but there's still actions. So like writers can write action sequences, they can write non-dialogue. So they can sell it like, hey, you know what, your character hasn't been challenged, you know, like for the past 20 minutes, they're just skating through all these like bosses. It's just like, maybe you want to have something else happen, you know, make them not just backtracking for keys or like, you know, turn around at a dead end, but, you know, like just having another pair of eyes, you know, having someone else on your team to be like, what if this happened? You know? All right, so this is about the protagonist, the main character of your story. How do you create them? So what I think of when I think of most video games, there's probably more types of protagonists than this, but I'm just going to talk about two today. The everyman is basically, because we know that everybody is interacting with the rest of the game through the protagonist, like the Mario, the Link. This is how we get people excited about our game and our world, so at least make that main character exciting. Because if they're too wooden, then like nobody really cares about their struggles and their problems that they're having. Another one that I like to use personally is the Overman character. Now this could also be done poorly with, I mean, like a character like Superman. There's not a lot of compelling gameplay in any Superman game that I've seen released. And he's not a very good character in films. But you can still have a powerful character, just make the problems that they deal with all that greater. You know, if it's fighting with gods, literally, then do that. Or, you know, like the moral dilemmas of having power. So, you know, you want to work with the themes of them being an outsider. This is like Geralt can be considered an Overman because he is he's feared and rejected because of all the power that he has. So these are your Perseus heroes again. They're just like us. They have like, I believe that these characters are both engineers in their respective universes. Because one guy's just sent to repair a spaceship and the other one is like a scientist or something. Most characters are this, the everyman, and then they just get like all the weaponry to succeed, to shoot their way through every situation that they find. So there's a couple of quotes up there to give us an opportunity to talk about the Overman again. Even like, you know, they have the archetype of an everyman or an Overman, and it doesn't have to be a man. I'm not talking about just your male characters. It could be man, woman, child, a dog. You know, just like you have to be aware of what level of story, what your story is, what world it is in, and what you're trying to say. So if you have these themes where it's about imposing your own like will on the way that you're going to live your life, then it might be considered an Overman type of character. So the big ones that I have for examples are the main character in BioShock, which is Jack. He has a mysterious background, but he goes to the city of Rapture and finds there's an immense power struggle underneath the ocean. And the other one is Zeus from Prototype, who typically with the Overman characters, it's about not just like defying the gods that exist for you. because Prometheus was the Titan and he stole the fire from Mount Olympus to give to the humans so that there wouldn't be any like tyranny of the gods. They would have fire down on Earth and all that. But making your character like a revolutionary or like part of some new evolutionary progress or transcendent experience, then you have an Overman character. So, all right. So this is about the other characters. Any questions so far? All right. So who's the second most important character in one of your games that you might be thinking about in your head, like Cloud Strife?
Yeah.
He's the second most important character? Who's the first most?
Ellie.
Who?
Ellie?
Ellie from The Last of Us is definitely on this list. Yep.
I was thinking Luigi,
Luigi, sure.
the original.
Yep. Okay. So, if you have a deuteragonist who is an NPC, it's very important not to make the entirety of your game into a boring, complicated escort mission where they're always just like dragging you back and like kind of like holding that tension there for the like. Don't use them as like, oh, I'm so weak, you have to help me repeatedly for hours and hours, because that's not fun gameplay. No, it's a good idea to make the second most important character strong or smart enough to kind of fend for themselves, and Ellie is that. She can avoid, like making noises to alert the zombies. And Elizabeth is that too. She's not just a damsel in distress. Even though she starts her game when you meet her, she's in confinement, but the story unfolds and shows how important and eventually how capable she is as a character, especially when you get to play as her in some of the DLC. So, just some of the things to avoid would be to just allow damsels to exist in your game, because that's not fun. Now the antagonists are, and Leah, we're getting to the part where there's the spoiler. Yeah. All right. The best villains are the most memorable part of your game sometimes, because, as they say, your hero's only as good as their antagonist. The characters that I most like to see are like in Batman, the Rogues Gallery. You have the Joker, the Scarecrow. Yeah. I know there's 100 and something others that I'm not going to mention right now, but when you think about a good game, how often does the villain really outshine the hero? Like, how often when you're playing Mega Man are you thinking, oh man, Cutman, he's such a hard boss, but like you're not really thinking of Rock when you're playing Mega Man. You're just thinking of the other master robots. Does your game even really need a climactic boss battle? Is it always the best reward to distribute? Like, hey, you've made it to the ultimate point of our game. Here's the climax, a really difficult to kill boss that has 1,000,000 HP and 1,000,000 waves of minions to throw at you. No, that's not always the best reward, because there's other types of video games. There's puzzle games, there's adventure games, there's games where you just talk to people. So the climax is something that needs to happen in your narrative. There needs to be the challenge that is the hardest challenge that you're offering to your players, but it doesn't always need to be a boss that has 1,000,000 hit points. So now we're back on to Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. I always do the bad examples first before the good examples. And I think that Zant is a really bad example narratively. A good example of a bad villain. So because of his mysterious nature, the helmet that he wears, and his authority over this Twilight realm, this world that you haven't even heard of that kind of exists parallel to your own world, he seems really mysterious and threatening at the beginning of the game. But as you find out, he is he's bizarre in the end, but he's not threatening anymore. So what you end up having is a disappointing and ultimately very forgettable boss fight with him. The gimmick, though, is that he teleports you from one place to another where you've already fought all the other bosses. It's like, hey, look at all the things you did. But then it's just like, what is this fight? Like, I forget about it in comparison to, of course, he's being manipulated by Ganon, because it's always Ganon in the Zelda series. But, so whenever you do finally get to fight Ganon, you fight him 5 different ways. So it's an ultimate like challenge of everything that you have learned from sword riding skills, horseback combat. You know, the wolf form gets a boss fight in there somewhere. So that's it's an okay way of doing it. You know, once again, it's like the boss is always like shape-shifting his way into more and more forms and more health points and all that. But it was at least more interesting than Zant. All right, so for Frank Fontaine, your main antagonist in the BioShock, the first game, he is introduced to you as a thug. He's a criminal mastermind. And he goes through his transformation to Atlas, who has been manipulating you through mental commands, through hypnotic suggestion, and he's the big boss. Again, he has 1,000,000 hit points, and he changes from like a fire and lightning form to some other forms throughout the rest of it. But it also kind of has to do with the philosophy of this game and the philosophy of Ayn Rand. So it's really interesting that he turns into a character like this, but I don't think it's necessarily very satisfactory. And sometimes the ultimate villains are, if you're telling a story of an anti-hero, of a morally compromised person, or a person who just does bad things, sometimes that villain is either yourself or somebody who's so much like you, but they're more extreme in their views. They're willing to sacrifice lives, and maybe you're not. Maybe you're only willing to sacrifice someone's life if they are also an evildoer. But you know, the world isn't black and white. If you're writing a character like this, it's just different shades of gray, and their shade is just much darker than yours. So you need to stop them from killing people. And that was it. That was the talk. These are different links to all the articles and different resources that I've used for this talk. Thank you all so much for watching.
Alright, I will have the slides. I think I'll get those from Winston after, and they will be posted on the meetup page and on the website and all that. Yeah. I think there's still more food and pop and everything. You guys welcome to stick around and chat and stuff. Yeah. Thanks, guys. Good job, Winston.